Today I have Mads Christensen back on yet another podcast, which is great. Mads is a program manager on the Visual Studio team. How are you, Mads?
Hello, Jesse. I'm doing very well, thank you. And thanks for having me back.
Well, I can't thank you enough for walking me through so many of these topics over the past couple of weeks. What
Mhm.
I want to do today is talk about Visual Studio and talk about Visual Studio Code. But what I don't want to do is get into a discussion of which one's better, because that is a matter of religion, and better for what? So that is where I want to go, which is whether there are differences and there are targeting differences, and when might you want to do each. So let's take that, let's break that down, take that one at a time. What would you, if I asked you what the principal differences are between Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code? Let's start there.
Yeah. So before I answer that question, let me just preface this with saying that I know infinitely more about Visual Studio than I do about Visual Studio Code and how the positioning of Visual Studio Code and all that is done. Um, but I can definitely talk about it from the Visual Studio's point of view, if you will, and from my own personal, because there's something in there too. Um, so to your question, it's in Visual Studio, the whole point of Visual Studio, the mission of Visual Studio, is to create the most lovable developer experience for C Sharp and C++ developers. So .NET and C++. That is, you're gonna get the most premier experience on the planet for those two types of technologies in Visual Studio. That is our mission. That is our goal. That is what we strive to do.
I'm sorry, did you say C++ or C sharp?
C Sharp and C++.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, both.
I have a
Um,
warm spot in my heart for C++,
oh,
but
okay.
it's been 25 years. Is that possible? 2000 when the early bits came out for C sharp. And
Yep.
I got C sharp and I said, I'm not going back and you can't make me. And I've been in C sharp ever since.
But I think C++ has been growing too, and it's alive and doing very well, and it's very good for some scenarios. And Visual Studio is kind of at the forefront of C++ development, and of course with C Sharp and .NET in general, like VB, F Sharp, and so on. But that's our mission, is to create that lovable experience for those two things, and Visual Studio is the premier place on Windows to work on those technologies. And I do say Windows because Visual Studio only works on Windows. So if you're on a Mac or if you're on a Linux, you can't actually use Visual Studio unless you use some sort of VM or DevBox in the cloud or something, but then you're on Windows, right? And so I don't count that when I say Mac or Linux. And so we offer C++ extensions and C Sharp extensions for VS Code. And so that's where we're saying, hey, if you're on those other platforms, VS Code with these extensions, that is what we then recommend. Um, but VS Code is kind of this polyglot. It's kind of agnostic when it comes to languages, and it relies on a lot of extensions to provide these languages and experiences around them when it comes to like launching and debugging and all type of things is kind of provided. Maybe to different capacities for each of these languages, right? So you'll have languages that have little support, and you have languages that have a lot of support around, like maybe have auto completion and all sorts of debugging and all sorts of support, right? And so typically, what we say is, if you're doing .NET or you're doing C++ development, come to Visual Studio. If you're doing pretty much anything else, VS Code is a fantastic place to be. So
Okay,
that's how we look at it.
that's a great start intro. Let's dive a little bit deeper. Is there a difference, not so much in the platform, but in the programmers, the skill, the history, that one is more targeted at than the other?
Yeah, I think history is definitely different, because with Visual Studio, that came out of has a history of VB back in the 90s.
Do
It
you remember
came,
Lightspeed?
yeah, right, exactly, and um, and also, they have that rich history, and the typical more the enterprise appeal, enterprise scenarios are something that Visual Studio have been prioritizing from like the very beginning. And if you take something like VS Code, what I think was probably more targeted the end user, the developer themselves, and teams, because they have Git tooling built in and all that. So they're great for like teams and for individuals and students and professionals alike. But the enterprise play was more developed maybe originally in Visual Studio. And so there's just a lot of there when it comes to like governance and all these enterprise concepts um, have been more developed for Visual Studio over all these decades, right? Visual Studio turns 29 next time.
I don't mean to interrupt, but can you just define governance in that context?
Yeah, like also like when it comes to like security and management of like if you're an IT pro and you manage a fleet of machines for your developer division, right? If you're, let's say you're a bank or a financial institution or something, and you have 2,000 developers, like you want to be able uh, to manage that fleet of Visual Studio installations in a way that's like safe and in a way that's in accordance with your principles in your enterprise, right? What are the permissions? What are they allowed to do? Can they install extensions? What extensions are allowed? And so on and so forth. And so Visual Studio has always had kind of a lot when it came to that enterprise segment. So that's the kind of that's part of the governance, um, security, and so on. And you don't see a lot of that in early startups and individuals. They don't have those kind of needs, and so that's not what they're going to ask for, right? But it's something that enterprise customers ask for, and so that there's a differentiator there as well. Um,
And,
but I think
and
that's part of the history.
yes, thank you. And you said Visual Studio is how old?
It's turning 29 next time.
Oh man, I am old.
I believe
That's
is it
just
March?
sad.
Is it March 19? We'll have to.
29. Because I remember when, okay, never mind. Uh, um, GitHub. Is
Yeah.
there a difference in Visual Studio VS Code with reference to GitHub?
Not to my knowledge. No.
I'm sorry, Siri has gone to answer your question.
Oh,
Just
that's
one
nice of her.
moment. Siri, go away. Sorry. We're going to keep that in.
Yeah.
I'm
Good.
sorry, you were starting
It
to
happened
say.
to me yesterday too. Come again?
You were starting to say about GitHub. And I'm
Yeah, I don't think.
specifically interested in the experience of coding on GitHub and interacting with GitHub and GitHub Copilot and so forth. Is there a difference between what a Visual Studio developer would experience versus a VS Code developer would experience?
Um, I think if you're in Visual Studio or in VS Code, you're going to have a similar experience in the sense that you have a source control provider and you can commit your changes and so on. Commit messages, sending pull requests. I think there's somewhat even support. I think there are features that VS Code has that Visual Studio don't have, and the other way around. But that's not a GitHub specific thing. That's a Git specific thing usually. So it doesn't matter if it's GitHub or ADO or whatever other provider you might have or local Git, right? Um, so, but when it comes to GitHub, other things around GitHub, like GitHub Actions, how do you write GitHub Actions, for instance? Um, then there might be some differences there where there's exist some extensions for VS Code and there's other extensions for VS and they do things differently. And so yes, it's going to be a different experience, but I think they're comparable. Where it gets different is if you go onto github.com and you can, any repo has like this green button. It's a drop down. You can say open in VS Code or open in Visual Studio. They both have that. Like they're both represented even in there. But you have the github.dev where you can basically take a repo and open it in a browser version of VS Code. Now Visual Studio cannot run in a browser. VS Code is written in TypeScript. It can run in a browser. Visual Studio cannot. And so that's a huge difference when you think about it that way. So the GitHub experience, when you're on GitHub and you kind of want to play around with something in the browser, you're getting the VS Code experience. Does that
Okay.
make sense?
Yes, that's helpful.
Mhm.
Uh, I've been a C sharp developer, but specifically a user of Visual Studio since before Visual Studio. So that
Mhm.
29 years you were talking about. And the question comes to me all the time, to myself, is there an advantage to also learning VS Code at this point? Or can I comfortably stay in Visual Studio? And one of the things that pushes me a little bit towards VS Code is it appears, I don't know if it's true, that some of the features such as Copilot and Copilot agents and so on are hitting VS Code first. So I'm hitting you with two questions. Is there a
Yep.
reason for me to learn VS Code, and might that be that those things are coming in first, and why are they coming in first to VS Code?
All right. Yeah, let's take those. So yes, I think there's a lot of reason to use VS Code for certain things. I use it myself. I have them pinned in my Windows taskbar right next to each other. Uh, Whenever I work on, so I'm not a C++ developer. I'm a C sharp person, and so whenever I work on anything C sharp, it is in VS Visual Studio. But there might be other reasons why I want to use VS Code. If I want to edit like .NET Framework non SDK style CS proc file, I have an extension that I wrote for Visual Studio that let me may open any file or folder in Solution Explorer, have that open up in VS Code. And so I actually use it quite often to edit my .NET Framework CS proc files or SLN files or something like that. Um, so that's kind of common. Also, if I have like something that's text or different language that where I know the language is not supported, it's nice. It's kind of a lightweight editor. I can do things really kind of simply, and I don't pollute kind of my Visual Studio. So there's some times where I don't want things up in my recent list, and so in Visual Studio, because I have certain things that I kind of like to have easy access to, and so if I don't want to pollute my MRU list, my most recently used list, I do VS Code for files. Um, Markdown, there seems to be more like linters and tooling around Markdown, for instance, in VS Code. So that might be a reason you want to do that. If you have, if let's say you are someone that writes documentation, then it might be a great thing for you to use some of those linter tools that are available in VS Code. They've actually gotten really good in Visual Studio as well. So there is the Markdown Editor V2 extension for Visual Studio that provides a lot of the same things. But there are some very specific things about writing certain types of documentation style that you get in VS Code you don't get in Visual Studio.
So I
So
wonder who wrote that extension.
yeah, for Visual Studio, I might
Yeah,
have had something to do with that.
yeah, man.
But even the just the built-in Markdown support in Visual Studio is getting better. So in the latest version here, we have mermaid diagram rendering is now supported. So like that keeps evolving too. And they might have had it for a while over in VS Code, and and that's just because you use kind of things for different purposes. But it's very clear people want better Markdown in Visual Studio, and so that is something we're looking at and working on. So
And
um,
the other question I had hit you with is why, if I'm right, is Copilot and Copilot features hitting VS Code first?
a couple of reasons. One one of those reasons do not exist anymore. But VS Code ships every month, and they have the insiders built, which ships. When does that ship? Weekly or daily or something?
Yeah, hourly, I think.
Yeah, hourly. Yeah, it
Maybe
ships
by the
pretty
minute.
frequent.
I don't know. It's fast.
Yeah, it's fast. Visual Studio ships every quarter, 3 to 4 months. And so sometimes a feature that's, because we have a Copilot team in Visual Studio and there's a Copilot team in VS Code. And so whenever there's a new capability in the Copilot APIs from GitHub, for instance, they could work on this implementing these features at the same time. But because the release vehicle is faster moving on VS Code, their users get it first. Whereas we might sit on that feature for a month or two before we're able to ship it, or a month before it gets into the Visual Studio preview, let's say. So it might end up in preview, but then it's not in the stable release yet because that is only 3 to 4 months. That is the exact reason why in the summer here of 2025, June was the first time we shipped a monthly release of Visual Studio. We started a monthly release cadence. So we shipped June, July, August, September is coming up, a new release. So we're doing monthly feature releases. instead of quarterly. And so that's something we're going to continue with. And with the new version of Visual Studio, it's the exact same thing every month.
That's
And
great.
sometimes actually even faster. It depends. There could be situations, and there has been situations where we've snuck features in like these kind of service releases that we also deal with. That sits in between. So let's say we find a security bug or something like that that we need to fix immediately. We will issue a new build and make that available for people. And so there could be like every week there could be an update to someone's Visual Studio. It's not every update does not hit every user. Let's say that you decide to do C++. Now you install the C++ workload. Maybe in that particular workload is where there was a fix targeted. That means that you will now get that notification, hey, there's an update, because there was the C++ component in Visual Studio got updated. But anyone who doesn't have that component will not get that notification. So for the average user, you don't see the updates that we send with Visual Studio, but we actually ship Visual Studio weekly. But most people don't see that because not every release applies to them. But those feature releases that are monthly apply to everyone, and everyone will get the notification for those. So that whole reason number one, which is the most obvious one, it has to do with the release cadence, and it doesn't have to do with anything else. And that reason is now gone. The other reason is that the VS Code and the GitHub team is kind of the same team that works on the Copilot. And so they basically have access to some of these things. They come in there first just because it's that same team. And it's kind of a little bit in the nature of how it's organized and stuff, but it's, they got, GPT-5 mini came out a week ago for VS Code. It's out today for Visual Studio. So like some of these are like, oh yeah, it's a week late now. It's no longer like 2 months later. It's like, okay, maybe there's a week. Like, I think
Right.
we can be okay with that.
And I'm going to again interrupt you just because you dropped it. What is the difference between GPT-5 and GPT-5 Mini?
GPT-5 Mini is this one that's it's not a premium, so it's a part of the standard models that you don't pay premium for. So the mini part is like I assume it's a large language model, but it's not as large. I'm not sure exactly how
Yes.
that. I'm not exactly sure how that works
It's a
under the hood.
medium-sized language model.
Yeah, maybe.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. Let me go back to Git for a second. If you're
Mhm.
using Git as your source control approach,
Yep.
you can, if you want to stay in the Microsoft world, you can do that on GitHub and you can do that on Azure. Is Visual Studio or VS Code targeted more at one of those, or are they equally targeted at both, or how does that play out?
Um, I, I I may, without knowing, I'm guessing that VS Code probably has a tighter GitHub approach because the ADO, the Azure DevOps, is usually something that larger companies use and enterprises, and so it's much more kind of following into the Visual Studio customer base. And so for Visual Studio, we have great ADO support, Azure DevOps support for anything Git, and so it doesn't really matter if you use one or the other. We integrate with both, and uh, for just regular Git, that works in VS Code as well. But there are some features where it's like I don't know, for instance, if VS Code will be able to look up like issue tracker numbers and stuff like that in Azure DevOps as it supports it for GitHub, whereas Visual Studio does both. Like if you do in your commit message, if you hit up the pound sign, it will autocomplete with your open issues that you may want to reference from your commit
Right.
message, from whether DevOps or GitHub.
I got to tell you that calling it ADO is bringing back database flashbacks.
I know. I know. I just started calling it ADO. I was so against it because it messed with my thing. And I used, when I write it though, I write as AZDO with a lowercase z
Right. Right. I like
because
it.
I cannot, my brain can say ADO now, but my fingers cannot type it because to me that's ADO.net.
Right. Exactly. Let me ask you one more question about the difference between those two, and that'll bring us into the other topic, which is the Visual Studio extensions. And there are many. many Visual Studio extensions, more than most of them written by you. Do those extensions work on Visual Studio Code, or is that a separate world?
Um, they do not, and vice versa. There are, however, things that do work across the two, but not the extension themselves, but some of the stuff that's in them will work on both. So um, if we start with kind of like why are they not the same? So VS Code is built from the ground up in it's a JavaScript based thing, TypeScript. Visual Studio extensibility model was C++ or .NET. Now it's just .NET. Um, and so .NET and C and TypeScript are two separate ecosystems, right? How do you translate a NuGet package into like a TypeScript thing? If you have a reference, it's really not like they're not really compatible that way. But also just the surface, the API surface is just vastly different. So I can provide tool windows, I can provide custom toolbar icons and commands and UI to Visual Studio, whereas in VS Code I only have like a certain set of things I can do. Where in Visual Studio I can walk the entire WPF tree that makes up the UI, and I can do whatever I want. I can inject things into the WPF tree, and like I can, there's really no limits. Um, and with VS Code, it's much more kind of constrained into what they've allowed you to do, which is a great way of doing it. It's not like I don't think one is better than the other, but it is two fundamentally different approaches. And history again plays a role as to why things are the way they are. And so they're kind of fundamentally not compatible, those two. However, there's a bunch of things that are compatible. So, for instance, the language server protocol, LSP. So if I create a language server for a language, for Perl, let's say, then I can put that language server into a Visual Studio extension. And I can also put that same language server into a VS Code extension. The extensions themselves that carry that language server are different. And there's a little bit of code in there that knows how to call that same language server, but the language server is the same, and it's written in whatever language I want. It can be written in .NET or Go or whatever. Doesn't matter. As long as it can execute on the target machines, right? Where I install it.
Again, interrupting you, let me just clarify. When you say written in .NET, there's no language .NET. So are you saying that it's written in C# or what
Yeah,
are you saying?
like if it's run, yeah, if it's a C#, if it's .NET Core, if it requires the .NET runtime or .NET Core to be there, if it's a C# or VB, or it doesn't matter what the language is or the platform is. It could be any language that compiles to the needs the Java runtime as well. There are several languages that does that, right? That is not Java, but requires a certain runtime to be present to execute. That's fine as long as the wherever you install it can execute it. Then you can write it in whatever language you want, and so share those servers between VS and VS Code. So that's one aspect. Another one is TextMate grammar and syntax highlighting and all that comes in TextMate format, which is like this kind of people have a love-hate relationship with it, but it's a text-based way of expressing syntax highlighting, autocompletion, and things like that. And that you can do the same thing. The same grammar files can be transported inside an extension for each of these, and that works. Color themes is another one where you can convert a VS Code color theme to Visual Studio. There's a command line tool that does that, and then you can ship it in a Visual Studio extension. So there are things that can be shared across the two, but the mechanism of which they installed and they register themselves and all that are like just fundamentally different.
Got it. Before I let you go, on Ezra Klein, at the end of the discussion, he always asks for 3 book recommendations. I'm going to ask for 3 or more, if you like, extensions for Visual Studio that maybe people haven't heard about, but that you think are really cool.
Number one for me right now is one called File Explorer. So, unfortunately, I wrote it myself, so I'm gonna, I'm biased, of course. But File Explorer is one that basically puts all the files in your repo inside Solution Explorer as a node. So instead of you having to switch to like Windows Explorer to see all the files that are in your repo that is not in your solution, for instance, you can access them really easily. So if you have README files or GitHub workflow files or whatever it might be, git ignore, editor config, instead of you having to add them to solution folders or something like that, you can just easily access your entire repo from there. So that's one that I really, really enjoy. Markdown is another one. Markdown Editor V2. Make sure you get the one that's called V2. That's another one that I use every day, and it turns the Markdown editing experience kind of into almost like a word processor, where keyboard shortcuts like Control B to make things bold or Control I to make it italic. All that stuff works the way if you have a bullet list and you hit Enter, it inserts the next bullet and you can start typing just like in Word. It it's a it makes it very pleasurable if you're writing a lot of Markdown. You definitely need that extension. And I'd say number three is one called Image Optimizer. So whether I do web, I have a web background, web developer background, and so I've always keen on optimizing my images so that people don't have to download images that are bigger than they have to be. And so Image Optimizer helps you compress images either losslessly so that you can't see the difference. There's no loss of fidelity, but the image size shrinks, like the weight of the image shrinks. Or you can do it lossy, where it's like, okay, the quality is going down, but your human eye probably can't see it, but you can shave significant amount of kilobytes out of an image, like 40%, 50%, all the way up to 80% sometimes, depending on the image. And you can't tell. So you can just right click a folder and say optimize images, boom, and it does it for you, or an individual image. You can also right click an image and say, hey, resize, and you can give it new dimensions and it will resize it on disk.
I know that you are constrained by time. I have to thank you. This has been great. I'm going to beg you to come back again. And there are a number of topics, but this was just terrifically informative, and I truly appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me on, Jesse. I appreciate it.